dark side of conservation. Munganga Nakulire is born in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, not far from the border with Rwanda and Burundi. He's a member of an indigenous hunter-gatherer community called the Batwa.
My name is Fiore Longo. I am a campaigner at Survival International, the global movement for indigenous people's rights, and I am the head of what we call the Decolonized Conservation Campaign. With the name Batwa, we indicate people that live in a lot of places in Central Africa, but today we are going to talk specifically about the Batwa that live in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The Batwa have been here for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. They're part of a broader group of indigenous people who colonizers once called pygmies because of their short stature, but they prefer to be called the Batwa. The DRC is known for its incredible wildlife. The forest where Munganga grows up is buzzing with life. Forest elephants, chimpanzees, buffalo, wild boar, okapi, hippos, baboons, leopards. If you're very lucky, you might catch a glimpse of the eastern lowland gorilla. Munganga's ancestors once roamed freely through these trees, tracking animals, finding rare trees and plants for medicine. They're so good at it, the first European colonizers who arrived here called them human compasses. For this episode, we've been in touch with the Batwa community, with the people who lived alongside Munganga in the very same village. Because of everything that happened, they wanted to remain anonymous, but you'll be hearing from 3 of them in this episode. When talking about the role the forest plays in their everyday lives, this is what one of them told us.
Na ndani ya msitu yenyewe tunapata chakula, tunapata matunda, tunapata asali, tunapata nyama na mboga kwa ajili ya afya ya Wabatwa. Pia tunapata mule ndani dawa kupitia majani na miti ambazo hazipatikani nje ya msitu. Kwetu sisi Wabatwa, pori ni maisha ya Wabatwa. Pia ni nyumba, ni chakula, ni dawa, ni mila yetu, mbona kadhalika.
In 1970, when Munganga is a young boy, a Belgian conservationist arrives in the area. The DRC had been colonized by King Leopold II and Belgium for 7 decades, and there are still strong echoes from that time. So this Belgian conservationist arrives and declares the region where Munganga and his family live a national park. Eastern lowland gorillas are dying out because of civil unrest, and there are just a few hundred of them left. They need protection, and international conservation groups decide the way to do that is to bring 6,000 square kilometres of forest under strict protection. The Kahuzi-Biega National Park is born, poaching is banned, and only scientists and tourists are allowed entry. Suddenly, Munganga and his family become illegal squatters on their own land. Their homes are burnt to the ground, and those who resist face persecution and violence. So when he's just 5 years old, Munganga and his family up sticks and leave. The day they were told to leave is something that the Batwa still remember all too well, says this woman.
Matokeo yenye kitokea kwa sisi chama ya Batwa ilikuwa matokeo mabaya kwa sababu wakati walitufukuza jamii za Bambuti yani za Batwa zikaendelea kukufa sana.
Munganga and his family settle in makeshift villages on the fringes of the forest. He marries, and he and his wife have 2 children. They survive on about €1 a day by working in nearby banana orchards, and they're forbidden from entering the forest to look for food and medicine. Munganga says they live here like animals. The Batwa woman we spoke to said that life for their community inside these makeshift villages is very challenging.
Kwa sababu mule mlikuwa dawa yetu, sheo wa mama wa Batwa wakati mwanamke mumutwa alikuwa anabeba mimba mule, tunatosha mudawa. Wakati mimba naluma mama mbutikazi, tunakata ile dawa tunampatia na atazala mbio mbio, lakini wakati bali tufukuza mule ile dawa hatuipate tena, na njoo maana wamama wa Bambuti wanaanza kufa juu hatutapata tena ile dawa. Na kwa leo hii tunaishi maisha ya hatari sana, she banamuke babatwa juu hatutapata ile dawa, hatutapata ile maji mazuri, hatuna budongo kwenye tunaishi.
So as we arrive in the mid-2010s, here's the situation. On one side, we've got around 6,000 Batwa people who've been living on the outskirts of the forest for 40 years at this point. And on the other side, a growing conservation movement is making noise in the west. There are now only around 250 eastern lowland gorillas in the park, and huge international players want to be involved in saving them. Funds start to flow into the Kahuzi-Biega park from places like the American and German governments, the US-based Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Swiss-based WWF. Anti-poaching units are trained up, and patrol guards give their instructions. Tourists arrive in their hundreds, paying hundreds of dollars in the hopes of glimpsing one of these rare gorillas. Tensions begin to rise. The Batwa feel ignored, but slowly they get the attention of national and international human rights groups. In 2015, one of these groups brings a case before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on behalf of the Batwa. It says the Batwa have been deprived of their land, prevented from practicing their traditional livelihoods, and denied access to the most basic of social services. They face discrimination, malnutrition, disease, and death. But nothing comes of the case. It's still pending 2 years later, when, on that Saturday morning in August 2017, Munganga and his teenage son Christian leave their village and enter the Kahuzi-Biega National Park. Now, Munganga's got 2 sons. Christian is the oldest, and his youngest is back at home, ill. Munganga doesn't have the money to take him to hospital, so he and his other son Christian have set off in search of a rare species of medicinal plant. They're looking for something very specific. It's a tree they call Katangongo, with waxy black and brown leaves and colourful flowers. Armed with a machete to hack through the undergrowth, Munganga and Christian go deeper and deeper into the trees. Suddenly, standing before them is a group of rangers, eco-guards, paid and trained to protect the forest against illegal activities. There are 4 of them, and they're carrying guns. One of them opens fire on Munganga and Christian. Munganga is hit by 5 bullets. One gets him in the arm, and he falls to the ground. He manages to pick himself up and flee. Christian, unarmed, is shot. He collapses.
I remember my colleague told me that something very, very bad happened. At that time, we were already campaigning against atrocities in the name of conservation, so we were used to hear stories like this, but we were particularly shocked, especially because Nakulire was just a kid. He was 17 years old. Their only crime was to try to get in their ancestral land to find medicinal plants.
This is what happens next. Sometime later, Munganga arrives back at his village, badly wounded, and raises the alarm. He's taken to the nearest hospital, about an hour's drive away. A group from the village heads into the forest to look for Christian. After 4 hours, they find him. He's dead, his lifeless body abandoned. He's 17 years old. The group carries the body back to the village, and there's uproar. The next day, joined by others from neighbouring villages, the villagers descend on the park's headquarters, demanding compensation for Munganga and his family. Tensions rise. Some young members of the crowd shout they want to reclaim the forest and wave sticks and machetes to clear a place on the land to build their houses. The next day, at a sit-in protest, the head of the village announces, "We have never killed a gorilla, let alone an eco-guard or a tourist, so why are we killed in this way?" When we spoke to the Batwa community, one man told us how the killing impacted them.
Ndio kwa ile tuliweza huzunika kwa sababu sisi Wambuti hatuna makao na hatuna nafasi yoyote ya kukimbilia kwa kufanya matunzo ya kujitunza, lakini tulihuzunika sana kuona mtu anaenda tafuta dawa tena mshamba yetu inaenda kwa kifo yake. Ndio shi tunaitika shi Wambuti na shi hatuwezi twenda tumalize pori vile vile, kwa sababu hatuwezi pata pumuzi ya kupumua wala tupate mvula, lakini kuona walituambiaka juu ya makuni na tunaheshimia kuua nyama ovyo ovyo, lakini wanatugeuka.
Now, we don't know who the 4 eco-guards are. Reports say they're employed by the Congolese Institute for the Conservation of Nature and are trained and equipped by the WWF and the Wildlife Conservation Society. They have a dangerous job. Poaching is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and poachers have been known to shoot and kill rangers who stand in their way. We do have access to the patrol report from that day. The report, filled out by one of the guards, mentions the shooting. It describes Christian, who was unarmed, as a notorious poacher. And that's the only mention of what happened. The rest of the report reads like a normal day in the office. Illegal activities were discovered, the gorillas were successfully located, and the tourists had watched the apes with, quote, success and satisfaction. Meanwhile, Munganga writes a report of his own. He pens a letter to the president of the Wildlife Conservation Society, one of the major funders of the park. In the letter, Munganga writes about that day. He says he and his son came across the eco-guards and they suddenly opened fire. Munganga writes he heard one of them say to another, "We must not kill the child," and another reply, "We must kill him." In the letter, Munganga writes that his people are suffering. He says they were told that any major development on their territory would require the Batwa's prior consent. And yet, he goes on, nobody has ever sought their consent for the existence of the Kahuzi-Biega National Park. He asks why the Wildlife Conservation Society continues to fund it. "Nothing will ever make up for the loss of my boy," Munganga writes. "But I am filing this complaint so that you can help my people and me get justice." Here's Fiore.
The fact that a 17 years old was killed and died because he was trying to find medicinal plants to help his brother because he was sick was particularly for me emblematic of how unfair the system of what we call the conservation industry is.
4 days after that fateful day in the forest, the village attends Christian's funeral. The boy is buried in a wooden coffin covered with a white cloth. And in the weeks and months that follow, the Batwa are increasingly determined to get justice. A year later, in October 2018, 200 indigenous families enter the Kahuzi-Biega National Park and return to the areas where their ancestors used to live. It's unclear on whose orders, but the park's guards react with force. From 2019 to 2021, eco-guards conduct 3 large-scale forceful evictions, targeting at least 7 highly populated Batwa areas. Villagers' homes are burnt down. At least 20 Batwa are killed, and many more injured and detained. There are reports of torture and violent group rape.
These attacks that were carried from 2019 to 2021 have one objective. And the objective is actually the official title of the mission, and it was to purge the forest. So to take away all the batua from there. And they did this in the most violent possible way.
By 2022, tensions are at breaking point. A report is published by Minority Rights Group, a UK-based not-for-profit, which details a campaign of violence against the batua, saying it is, quote, emblematic of the widespread systematic violence inherent in the rigidly colonial conservation model widely used in East and Central Africa, funded and facilitated by a network of international entities.
It is terrifying to read this report, but it's most terrifying and dramatic to know that all along the way, in all these years since Nakulile was killed, including this event, the park could count with the support and funding of Western governments and Western NGOs.
So in all of this, who's responsible? Here's a quick history of conservation. The world's first national park is widely thought to be Yellowstone in the west of the US, which was established in the 1870s. From that point onwards, the conservation movement slowly but surely morphed and developed, and in the last 125 years, over 100,000 officially protected areas have been created worldwide. However, there's a concept that's developed alongside this movement. It's called fortress conservation.
And it's not a scientific model, it's actually very political. Fortress conservation means that in order to protect nature, we need to create a fortress around it. So a sort of fence. It could be a material fence, but it could be also symbolic.
Fortress conservation is basically this idea that nature needs to be cordoned off from humans to give it the best chance of flourishing.
So the idea is that nature is something completely separate from humans. So human interaction can only harm nature. That is the base of fortress conservation.
And today, around 15% of land is officially protected. This is vital in stopping species going extinct because of human activities. Things like large-scale food production is responsible for an astonishing 30% of biodiversity decline around the world. However, this concept of fortress conservation is a controversial one.
This model was born in the US. You might have heard about the first national parks like Yosemite or Yellowstone, and they were created on indigenous peoples' land. Indigenous peoples were evicted, accused of destroying these beautiful landscapes, but tourists and white elites were welcome. It's this model that is then imported in Africa by the expansion of colonial empires. And this is the way British colonizers or French colonizers decide to protect nature. We see that the fortress conservation model is based on the racist idea that indigenous peoples and local people cannot manage their own environment.
There are around 480 million indigenous people globally, around 6% of the world's population. And critics of this large-scale conservation movement say they're being unfairly labelled as poachers, criminals and squatters on land they've occupied and lived off for centuries. Huge groups of people, like Munganga, are becoming so-called conservation refugees.
You see tourists that pay to get in, and they can live inside in a hotel. They can stay inside in hotels. They can use jeeps to see the animals around. And all of these things pollute much more and destroy much more than the person who wants to access the land to collect medicinal plants.
Is conservation a new sort of colonialism?
So it's easy actually to blame the rangers and say, oh, well, they are violent. But this is not about the rangers. This is about the system that put the rangers in place. In the first place, they shot Nakulile because the conservation system allowed them to do it.
It turns out that what happened to Munganga Nakulile and his 17-year-old son in the forest that day is far from a one-off. In 2019, BuzzFeed published a report into the WWF's conservation forces around the world. It's titled WWF's Secret War, and it's a shocking read. Based on hundreds of interviews and confidential documents and emails, the report details widespread abuse of Indigenous people worldwide by eco-guards in national parks. According to the BuzzFeed report, villagers have been whipped with belts, attacked with machetes, beaten unconscious, sexually assaulted, shot at, and killed.
We have been documenting the same atrocities in many other parks, in many other countries, including India, Nepal, Cambodia, Thailand, Kenya, Tanzania. So this is not an isolated case. This is not just a bad apple. This is the model of conservation that is imposed in Africa and Asia, before by the colonial powers and now by big conservation organizations.
After that report came out, the German government, a major funder of the park, launched an inquiry into the allegations and found that no widespread atrocities had taken place. It said that park guards had been forced to defend themselves against armed Batwa, and any Batwa who died had been killed in the crossfire. The WWF says they don't tolerate any brutality by its partners, and that human rights abuses can never be justified in the name of conservation. They say that it's a, quote, delicate situation, but they can't exclude the possibility that such attacks are taking place. The WWF has commissioned their own independent review, which they say found no evidence that WWF staff directed, participated in, or encouraged any abuses. The WWF says they've embraced recommendations and implemented various measures to strengthen safeguards. They say they have, quote, network-wide responsibilities, standards, and commitments to environmental and social safeguards in all place-based work. And we are committed to supporting government entities in their work to protect human rights. The WCS says they condemn any instances of violence alleged to have occurred against Indigenous people, calling them illegal and horrific military attacks on DRC's own citizens. We reached out to the German government and the US government, both major funders of the park. They didn't respond. Here's Fiore.
Yeah, the question of the accountability is for me central, because there is no justice, right, without accountability. This park wouldn't exist without Western money. The rangers wouldn't be there without Western money, wouldn't have boots, wouldn't have anything, their uniform, without Western money. So without us, that shooting would have never happened. So when the question comes, who is accountable? I do think that every single funder of that park was accountable.
And so we return to Munganga and his family. What happened to them? Munganga continues to grieve for the son that he lost. And he says he can no longer work in the banana orchards since that day he was shot in the arm. What about Christian's killers? Whoever fired that gun and shot Christian dead was never brought to justice for what they did. There has been one small victory for Munganga and his people. It came in the height of the summer in 2024. After 9 long years of waiting for the outcome of that 2015 case, where human rights groups argued that the Batwa have faced discrimination, malnutrition, disease and death, and demanded recognition of their plight in the Kahuzi-Biega forest, the African Human Rights Commission finally made an announcement. They said that the Congolese government had violated the rights of the Batwa people when they evicted them from the national park all those years ago, and ordered the government to pay reparations. This is a landmark ruling, but will it change anything?
Rulings alone are not going to change the situation. We in survival believe, and this is our theory of change, that the only way to actually change something is mobilizing public opinion. The money that goes to Kahuzi-Biega, it's Western money. This is money coming from our taxes. We have the power as people to change this.
So in this war, with conservationists on the one side and indigenous people on the other, what's the answer? Here's the Batwa man whose voice you heard at the start of this episode for the final word.
Tena wakati tunaangalia tunaona kama wale walinzi wa Penkabe nao wanatumika, lakini hawatumike kikawaida kama walikuwa walianza kutumika huko mbeleni. Wakuwa wanaintegrate watu ama wapea wasikuwe wamewanyanyasa kihaki, na sirtu sana ni toa ya haki ya kupata udongo, kwani Wabatwa ndio waliweza kuchunga hiyo park na wanapaswa kuwa na kitu fulani kuhusu hiyo ulinzi wa mazingira, kwani hiyo msitu ni msitu ambayo inalindwa na dunia hata mzima, na hiyo ikifanyika watu wote watakuwa wametiwa kwa fasi za kwao, na itatusaidia ili kukua amani, iwe ni kati ya msitu ama Wabatwa.
This was